Have you ever just been struck by how some ideas, some movements, they just seem to explode? Going from small to massive scale seemingly overnight.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it makes you wonder, doesn't it? Like, what's the mechanism? How does that momentum build?
Exactly. Whether it's, I don't know, a social trend, some new tech, or even just a cultural shift. What's that secret sauce?
That really is the million-dollar question. How does individual belief turn into this huge, widespread change? How does that tiny spark just ignite something massive?
Right. And that's actually what we're digging into today on the deep dive.
Yeah.
We're looking at the dynamics of rapid growth, specifically in belief systems. And you've brought some really interesting source material.
Yeah, we've got this document that looks at the early Christian movement, how it grew according to the Book of Acts.
Hmm.
And then it draws parallels to a really modern phenomenon called training for trainers, or T4T.
Okay, so we have this ancient example of incredibly fast expansion side by side with a modern approach that seems to be tapping into maybe some of the same core ideas.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's a great chance to try and pinpoint what really drives that kind of, well, exponential growth.
And our goal here, it's not just about telling old stories. We want to get under the hood, right? Understand what powered this expansion back then and now. What were the key ingredients? And more importantly, what insights can you, listening right now, take away from this? Whatever your background or interests are.
Yeah, actionable insights. That's the aim.
Okay, so let's dive in. We're starting with what the document calls the first Discipleship Revolution. This is based on the Book of Acts. And the numbers right from the start, they are just, wow.
They really are striking. Luke, who wrote Acts, he keeps mentioning the growth. It's like a running theme in those early chapters. He's almost underlining how explosive it was from the get-go.
It really feels like that. You've got Acts 2.41, where, boom, about 3,000 people join up on day one.
2,000, yeah.
Then just a bit later, Acts 2.47, it says they were adding to their number daily.
And constantly growing.
And it keeps going. Acts 4.4 mentions about 5,000 men. Then Acts 5.14 says multitudes, men and women. And Acts 6.1, the number of disciples was just continually increasing. It sounds less like growth and more like an explosion.
It does. And what's really important, I think, is that it wasn't just this initial, flash in the pan. The text emphasizes that this growth kept going and it spread out geographically.
Right. Not just stuck in Jerusalem. It moves out pretty fast. Judea, Galilee, Samaria, even further. Acts 9.31 talks about churches throughout all those areas growing.
Yeah, spreading like wildfire.
Then you hear about lots of people believing in places like Antioch. And Acts 13.49 says the message was spreading through the entire region.
The entire region.
But maybe the most, startling claim is Acts 19.10. Over just 2 years in Ephesus, it says, all who lived in Asia heard the word of the Lord. I mean, Asia Minor, that's a huge area back then.
It's enormous. And if you think about the Roman Empire at the time, with its, established religions and social structures, that kind of rapid, widespread growth, it's pretty phenomenal.
And it wasn't necessarily a top-down thing, was it? Like, not just the original apostles driving it all.
No, that's a really key point the document makes. It highlights how ordinary believers were empowered, people who'd only been part of the movement for months, maybe even just weeks.
Okay, so that's a crucial insight then. Movements really take off when everyone feels empowered, not just the central figures.
Exactly. The text suggests the momentum wasn't just about Peter or Paul. It was fueled by these, quote, ordinary, months-old, and even weeks-old believers. That decentralized nature, it seems like that was absolutely critical for the speed and the reach.
It sort of paints this picture of like one spark setting off countless little fires everywhere. And what was the fuel? The document mentions loving evangelistic zeal and fervent obedience. So it wasn't just agreeing with ideas, it was more personal.
Precisely. It seems it was a deep personal conviction that led directly to action. People felt compelled to share what they'd experienced, what they believed, with everyone around them. It wasn't passive.
And this spread everywhere, remote places, big cities, small villages. You even mentioned that quote from Pliny the Younger, the Roman governor.
Yeah, writing about 50 years later, he calls it a contagion. That's his word, affecting many persons of every age, every rank, and also of both sexes, spreading to cities and villages. Pretty strong language.
It really shows how widespread it was perceived to be. And then there's Tertullian, a bit later, end of the 2nd century.
Right, his famous claim that Christians had filled all the places that belonged to you. Cities, islands, forts, towns, the military camps, the palace, the Senate, the marketplace. We have left you nothing but your temples.
Okay, maybe a little exaggeration there.
Possibly some hyperbole, yeah.
Yeah.
But it definitely conveys the massive impact they believed they were having.
So this idea of a twin call, you follow the beliefs and you actively share them, that seems fundamental.
That's a core insight, I think. Believing was intrinsically linked to sharing. It wasn't an optional extra.
Okay, let's look at Ephesus then. Acts 19. The document uses it as a kind of case study. What makes Ephesus so revealing about how this worked?
Well, Ephesus shows the sequence, right?
Yeah.
Paul starts sharing the message. Some people accept it, but then, opposition pops up.
Yeah, and instead of just arguing publicly, he changes tack. He pulls back and focuses on really training these new believers. It says he did this regularly, maybe daily, in this place called the School of Tyrannus.
And the result of that focused training is, well, it's pretty amazing. These new believers, and remember, many were likely recent converts from, pagan backgrounds, Artemis worship, magic, that sort of thing.
Right.
They become the main ones spreading the message further.
Okay, now this is where it gets really interesting for me. Because it wasn't Paul himself reaching all who lived in Asia.
Right.
It was these people he'd just trained, these relatively new believers, who took the message out to basically the whole Roman province of Asia in just 2 years.
It really highlights the power of equipping others, doesn't it? Paul basically sets up Ephesus as a training hub. He trusts these newer believers, empowers them pretty early on to lead and serve. He's not the bottleneck.
He's creating a multiplication effect.
Exactly. Recruit people, train them to share and train others, and that leads to new communities popping up everywhere. It's multiplication built right into the DNA of the process.
Okay, so that gives us a sense of that first wave. Now let's jump forward to this idea of a re-revolution. Training for trainers, T4T. How does this modern approach connect back to Acts?
Well, T4T is very explicitly presented as trying to apply those same core principles today. It's often called a church planting movement, or CPM, aiming for that rapid, widespread start of new faith groups. And calling it a re-revolution really drives home that idea of getting back to the roots, back to what made the early movement grow so fast.
And the key figure here is Ying Kai. Tell us about him. He wasn't starting from scratch, right?
No, not at all. Ying Kai was already, by all accounts, a pretty successful church planter in Hong Kong around the year 2000. He and his wife, Grace, were starting, one new church a year using fairly traditional methods.
Okay, pretty standard.
But then they felt this call to reach this huge, unreached population in a different part of Asia, millions of people. And they just realized, our current methods, they're good, but they won't scale. We can't reach millions this way.
It's that moment of realization, isn't it? That business as usual just won't cut it for such a massive goal. And this led him to look again at the Great Commission, Matthew 28.
Right, that foundational instruction. And he pulled out some key insights.
What stood out to him?
Well, 3 phrases mainly. First, go, not come.
Yeah.
Stressing, going to people, not just waiting for them to show up at a building.
Okay, proactive outreach.
Second, everyone, not just some, meaning share broadly, don't prejudge who might respond. But the really big one, perhaps, was make trainers, disciples, not just church members.
Make trainers, not just members. Okay, what's the difference there?
The emphasis shifted. It wasn't just about getting people in. It was about immediately equipping new believers to share their faith and help others start their own journey, instantly thinking about reproduction.
Ah, okay. So the core of T4T is basically train believers to share, then train those new believers to share, and so on, in a way that just keeps repeating and multiplying down the generations. Training trainers to train trainers.
That's the mantra, exactly. It's all about that exponential curve. Ying and Grace started training lots of small groups every week. As it grew, they shifted to bi-weekly, just to handle the volume. But always, the focus was empower the trainees to go train others.
And the results mentioned are, well, they're huge. Over 1.7 million baptisms, 150,000 new churches in about a decade, and something like 2,000 new small groups or house churches starting every month.
Yeah, those numbers definitely echo that rapid growth we talked about in Acts. It shows what can happen when that multiplication principle really takes hold. T4T is designed as this relatively short, maybe 12, 18-month all-in process that builds evangelism and discipleship together from day one.
There's also this other example, the Inanna people, Tier T training, rural trainers, very different context, right? Remote, largely illiterate community.
Yeah, and the Ina story is fascinating because it shows the adaptability of these principles. For years, conventional methods just didn't work there. Right. Very little progress. But then they shifted focus. Inspired by Acts and some early CPM examples, they started training local Ina believers, just ordinary people, to follow their faith and, crucially, to share it, to fish for men, as the saying goes.
So empowering the locals again.
Exactly. The emphasis was on starting new faith communities and training others to do the same thing. And after about 3.5 years of this new approach, boom, rapid growth, lots of new groups forming, even though they face persecution.
Wow, so that resilience comes from it being rooted locally. And TRT, training rural trainers, it developed sort of alongside T4T.
Yeah, around the same time, reinforcing this idea that these core principles empower locals. Train for multiplication, they seem to work across the board, urban, rural, it doesn't matter.
And speaking of urban, the document mentions 9 different urban church planting movements, all using T4T principles. What did they have in common?
Well, the fact that multiple independent movements in cities all kind of converged on T4T suggests there's something fundamentally effective there, even with city complexities. They adapted it, sure, to their specific context, but that core idea of equipping people to multiply, that was consistent.
And they saw results.
Yeah, significant results reported across the board, conversions, baptisms, new groups starting. And they often talked about reaching the 3rd generation, which is kind of benchmark showing the movement is truly multiplying on its own.
And it's gone global, clearly. Middle East, South Asia, Japan, even the U.S.
Right. These examples just show the sheer breadth of application. You have a family in the Middle East adapting T4T, seeing rapid growth among people from Muslim backgrounds. You see T4T being used as foundational training in South Asia among Hindu and Muslim groups. Reports from Japan suggest it helped break through some long-standing barriers.
And even here in the U.S., places like Waco, North Carolina.
Yeah, showing that even in places with many existing churches, this approach can effectively reach people who aren't connected to any faith community. It seems to resonate widely.
Okay, so let's try and distill this down. What are those core T4T principles that keep coming up, the drivers of this growth?
Okay, so the key things seem to be mobilizing existing Christians first, encouraging everyday lifestyle evangelism, not just special events, a big focus on what's called obedience-based discipleship. Basically, you learn something, you immediately try to do it.
Learn it, do it. Okay.
Yeah. Then, intentionally starting new groups or churches, developing leaders quickly from within those new groups, aiming for multi-generational impact, not just one layer deep, and crucially, empowering indigenous local leadership so it becomes self-sustaining.
Got it. Now, one point I found interesting was the shift in language moving from disciple sometimes to trainer. Why that change?
Well, the thinking is that the English word disciple can sometimes, for some people, imply a more passive role, like just soaking up information.
Like being a student in a classroom.
Kind of, yeah. Whereas the original Greek word, mathetes, just means learner or student. Using trainer tries to capture both sides. Yes, you're learning, but you also have an active responsibility to train others, to pass on what you've learned. It links learning and transmitting.
It's that whole freely you received, freely give idea.
Exactly. It builds in the expectation of multiplication. It's moving beyond just teaching, transferring knowledge to training, actually changing behavior and equipping others. The document references James 1.22, be doers of the word and not merely hearers.
Right, action-oriented.
T4T is framed as this all-in-one process. Sharing faith, guiding new believers, starting groups, developing leaders, it all happens together, integrated, not in separate silos.
And it sounds like it's not necessarily an all-or-nothing approach for existing groups. It could be a tweak or a full overhaul.
Yeah, that's important. The core principles can be adapted. You might integrate some aspects, or you might decide it requires a more fundamental shift. Depends on the context, the goals. But the underlying call is towards active participation, active multiplication.
Okay. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are the big takeaways for you? What really stands out?
For me, it's really the power of empowering just regular people, not relying only on the experts, and then the incredible leverage you get from training for multiplication. That seems absolutely key for any kind of rapid, widespread growth. And finally, that focus on action, on applying what's learned, seems vital both for personal growth and for spreading the ideas.
Yeah, both the history in Acts and the modern T4T stuff, they really hammer home that decentralized reproducible models are powerful.
Definitely.
And for you listening, maybe think about how these models apply beyond just these specific examples. Any area where you want to see growth create impact. Could these ideas of empowerment, training for multiplication, focusing on action, could they be relevant? What really jumped out at you from our discussion?
It really makes you think about the mechanics of influence, doesn't it? I mean, if a movement driven by, frankly, relatively new believers could have such a massive impact on the Roman Empire.
Right.
And if we're seeing similar patterns today with things like T4T in all sorts of places, What's possible if these principles were more widely grasped and applied? What could happen if we really focused on training and empowering others to act?
That's a powerful thought to end on. Definitely gives us a lot to chew on. If this sparked your interest, you might want to read the Book of Acts yourself or look more into Training for Trainers, T4T online. There's plenty more to explore. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.